Captain Morrison, there's been some unusual activity with your family trust account. The words came through the encrypted satellite link from my grandfather's attorney, Richard Blackstone. I was sitting in a cramped communications tent at Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan when my entire world cracked open. Outside, the temperature was 110 degrees, sand was everywhere, and the war was grinding on as it had for months. But inside, everything went cold. My name is David Morrison, 35 years old, and 32 minutes ago, I was just another Army Ranger captain focused on keeping my men alive. Now I'm staring at a laptop screen, watching my wife Sarah explain to a bank manager why she needs to access another $300,000 from our account. The timestamp shows this conversation happened 3 days ago. She's wearing a dress I've never seen, sitting next to a man I don't recognize, and she's not wearing her wedding ring. I've been deployed for 8 months. 8 months of 4 a.m. raids, convoy security, and training Afghan forces. 8 months of missing Sarah's voice. Counting days until I could hold her again. Planning our future together with my grandfather's inheritance secure in our joint accounts. We video called twice a week when the connection allowed it. She told me about her job at the art gallery, about missing me, about how she was carefully managing the money grandfather left us. She never mentioned a man named Jeremy Fletcher. She never mentioned moving him into our Beacon Hill apartment while I was dodging IEDs and returning fire in the mountains of Afghanistan. The inheritance was substantial, $2.5 million in cash and securities, plus the family summer estate in Martha's Vineyard, worth another $1.8 million. My grandfather, William James Morrison III, had built a fortune in shipping and real estate over 7 decades. His death last year hit me hard. We were close. He taught me chess, took me sailing, shared stories of his own military service in Korea. When the lawyers read his will, I was stunned. Most of the family wealth came to me, his eldest grandson, with specific instructions that it remain in our bloodline. He watched too many fortunes dissolve through careless marriages and poor decisions. There were protections built into the trust, but those protections assumed I'd be alive to monitor them. Sarah had seemed perfect when I met her 5 years ago at a charity gala in Boston. She was intelligent, beautiful, working as a curator at the Gardner Museum. We had long conversations about art, history, literature. She supported my military career, understood the deployments, never pressured me to leave the service. Her own family was comfortable, but not wealthy. Her father was professor at Tufts, her mother a pediatrician. Good people, solid middle-class values. When grandfather left us the inheritance, Sarah seemed genuinely overwhelmed. I don't know how to handle this kind of money, she told me. What if I make a mistake? I thought her humility was charming. I should have paid more attention to the way her eyes lingered on the trust documents, how quickly she mastered the account access procedures. Before this deployment, we'd talked about buying a larger apartment in Back Bay, maybe starting a family when I returned. Sarah managed our finances while I was overseas. We had a joint checking account for daily expenses, and she had limited access to the trust funds for emergencies. The arrangement seemed reasonable. I trusted her completely. When Richard called today, his voice tight with concern, I expected routine business. Maybe a question about tax implications or investment strategies. I didn't expect him to tell me that Sarah had systematically drained our accounts while I was half a world away, fighting a war I believed in for a country I loved, and a family I thought loved me back. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank surveillance footage showed Sarah entering the trust apartment with Jeremy Fletcher 3 months ago. They convinced the bank manager, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, that there was a family emergency. Sarah produced a power of attorney document, one I'd never signed. My signature had been forged, skillfully enough to pass casual inspection, but crude enough that a forensic analyst would spot it immediately. Mrs. Hartwell later admitted she'd had doubts, but didn't want to embarrass a customer by questioning documents that appeared legitimate. In 3 visits, they'd managed to transfer $900,000 to various accounts. The Martha's Vineyard property had a new mortgage application pending, one that would leverage the estate's full value. Sergeant Mike Torres, my radio man, noticed I hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. "You okay, Captain?" he asked, glancing up from his equipment. I closed the laptop and nodded. Family stuff, I said. Nothing that can't wait. But it couldn't wait. With each hour that passed, more of my grandfather's legacy disappeared. Richard was following a paper trail that led through shell companies and overseas accounts. Sarah and Jeremy weren't just stealing. They were professional. This was planned, sophisticated, and almost certainly not their first operation. Our last video call had been 6 days ago. Sarah looked tired, distracted. She mentioned stress at work, problems with her boss. I offered to call the gallery director, see if my MIT connections might help. She declined quickly, said she could handle it herself. I should have wondered why someone stressed about work was wearing expensive jewelry I'd never seen before. I should have asked why our apartment looked different in the background of her calls. The art on the walls had changed. The furniture looked newer. There were flowers delivered daily, visible through the window. Sarah never bought herself flowers. She said it was wasteful when they just die anyway. Richard scheduled another call for the following day. He needed to walk me through the full extent of the theft and our legal options. Meanwhile, I had a mission to focus on. We were planning an operation against a Taliban compound in a valley 50 kilometers north. Intelligence suggested they were manufacturing IEDs there, the same kind that had killed 2 of my rangers last month. I couldn't let personal problems compromise my men's safety. But as I reviewed the operation plans, Sarah's face kept intruding. The woman who used to cry when I deployed, who sent care packages with my favorite books and Vermont cheddar cheese, who promised to wait for me no matter how long I was gone. How long had she been planning this? Had she started the moment my grandfather died, or had she waited until I deployed, using my absence as cover? The next evening, Richard's face appeared on my laptop screen again. Behind him, his law office overlooked Boston Harbor. The photographs and documents spread across his desk painted a picture that made me sick. Jeremy Fletcher was 33, recently divorced from a woman who accused him of theft. Charges that were dropped when money mysteriously appeared in her accounts. He worked as an investment consultant, but had no legitimate client base. His apartment was rented under a false name. Sarah had met him at a wine tasting in Cambridge 3 weeks before my deployment. She'd been researching estate management, supposedly to better handle grandfather's trust. Jeremy had introduced himself as a financial advisor, specializing in trust structures. They've been very careful, Richard said, sliding documents across his desk, so I could see them through the camera. Every transaction appears legal on its face. Sarah had legitimate access to portions of the trust. The forged power of attorney gave her access to the rest. They moved money slowly at first, small amounts that wouldn't trigger automatic reviews. Larger transfers came later, always with plausible explanations. A new art purchase for the gallery that Sarah said she was facilitating. A property investment that Jeremy recommended. Medical expenses for your grandmother that didn't exist. Your grandmother has been dead for 3 years. What destroyed me wasn't just the theft. It was the premeditation, the patience, the way Sarah had looked me in the eye during our last leave together, kissed me goodbye at Logan Airport, and promised to take care of everything while I was gone. We'd made love the night before I left. She cried, said she was already missing me. Had she already decided then? Had Jeremy been waiting in some hotel while she played the devoted army wife one last time? I asked Richard about my options. He was blunt. From Afghanistan, I was essentially powerless. I could freeze the remaining accounts, but Sarah would know immediately and might accelerate her theft. We could file criminal charges, but that would take months to process, and she could disappear with whatever money remained. The best strategy was to monitor, document, and prepare for a counterattack when I returned. Richard had already hired a private investigator named David Chun, a former FBI financial crime specialist who'd help families recover assets after complex frauds. Chen's first report arrived 2 days later. Sarah and Jeremy were living openly in our apartment. They'd replaced our bed, our furniture, most of our shared belongings. Sarah told neighbors I was considering leaving the army, that we were going through a rough patch. She'd thrown away my civilian clothes, given away wedding photos, removed all evidence of our marriage from the apartment. To the outside world, Jeremy was her boyfriend. I was a past she was moving beyond. They ate at our favorite restaurants. shopped in our old haunts, lived in the life we'd built together. But they were careless in one important way. They underestimated both my resources and my determination. Grandfather hadn't just left me money. He'd taught me lessons about patience, strategy, and the importance of legal documentation. Every summer at the Martha's Vineyard State, he'd shared stories of business deals, legal battles, and the value of thorough preparation. Never negotiate from weakness, he'd said, and never telegraph your moves to an opponent. Those lessons served me well in the military. Now they'd serve me in a different kind of war. I began preparing for my return. My commanding officer, Colonel James Patterson, understood the situation without my needing to share details. We'd served together in Iraq. He knew how deployment strained marriages, had seen good soldiers destroyed by betrayal at home. When I requested emergency leave, he approved it immediately. "Protect your family, Morrison," he said. "We'll hold things down here." I was scheduled to return to Boston in 6 weeks. By then, I wanted to know everything about Sarah and Jeremy, their plan, and most importantly, how to stop them. The next weeks passed in a blur of mission planning and private investigation. Each morning brought new intelligence from Chun. Sarah had quit her job at the Gardner Museum the day after I deployed. The story about work stress had been fiction. She was unemployed, living entirely off my inheritance. Jeremy was more than just a thief. He'd been married twice before, both times to women with significant assets. His first wife, a pharmaceutical heiress, had lost $4 million before she realized what was happening. His second wife, a military contractor, had defended him even as he liquidated her accounts. The pattern was always the same: charm, romance, quick marriage or cohabitation, systematic theft, and disappearance before consequences arrived. Chun discovered something else. Sarah and Jeremy weren't operating alone. They were part of a network of people who specifically targeted military spouses during deployments. A research analyst named Patricia Wells identified vulnerable families through public records and social media. A lawyer named Marcus Stone created the legal frameworks for transfers. A banker named Thomas McGrath facilitated the movement of funds. Sarah hadn't just betrayed me. She betrayed every military family they'd victimized. 2 weeks before my departure, Chin sent photos that nearly broke my restraint. Sarah and Jeremy were hosting a dinner party in our apartment. The guests were laughing, drinking wine I'd been saving for special occasions, eating off china we received as wedding gifts. Sarah wore a necklace from my grandmother's collection, something I'd specifically asked her to keep safe. The man beside her had his hand on her back, comfortable in the space I called home for 4 years. They looked happy. They looked like a couple planning a future with money they'd stolen from a man fighting a war. Master Sergeant Bill Hayes found me that night, sitting alone on the observation post, staring at nothing. Hayes had served 20 years, seen every kind of tragedy that could befall a soldier. "Wife problems?" he asked, settling beside me. I nodded. "She taking care of business while you're gone?" I laughed bitterly. "Something like that." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Whatever's happening, handle it right. This rage you're carrying will eat you alive if you let it. But channeled properly, it's a weapon. Use it. Don't let it use you." His words stuck with me through the final weeks. I channeled my rage into preparation. With Richard and Chun, I built a legal strategy that would strip Jeremy and Sarah their ill-gotten gains and provide justice to their other victims. We identified every account, every asset, every financial instrument they'd touched. We prepared criminal charges for forgery, wire fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Most importantly, we activated provisions in my grandfather's trust that I'd never thought I'd need. Clauses that would automatically reclaim any funds transferred under fraudulent circumstances. Penalties that would triple the amount Sarah owed if she couldn't return the money immediately. On my last night in Afghanistan, I video called Sarah one final time. She answered from our bedroom, Jeremy visible in the background. She looked nervous, guilty. "David, you look tired," she said. "This deployment seems harder than the others." I agreed. It had been the hardest deployment of my career, but not for reasons she understood. "I'll be home soon," I told her. "We'll sit down and talk about our future." about the money grandfather left us, about what we owe each other. Something in my tone must have worried her, because she spent the rest of the call trying to sound enthusiastic about my return. Jeremy left the room when I mentioned missing our apartment, missing the life we'd built together. What's our plan? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. 8 months of military focus had trained me to compartmentalize emotion during operations. This was an operation now, not a marriage reconciliation. Richard pulled into the hotel parking lot where I'd be staying. The Copley Plaza Hotel felt appropriately anonymous, a place for travelers passing through rather than residents returning home. Tomorrow morning, we serve papers, he said. Full asset freeze, fraud charges, criminal conspiracy allegations. The DA's office is ready. FBI Financial Crimes Unit is ready. Everyone's just waiting for your confirmation. And Sarah? Chun handed me another folder. She's retained Martin Goldberg as her attorney. Goldberg's good. Expensive. He specializes in defending white-collar criminals and disgraced politicians. The fact that she's already lawyered up tells us she knows this is coming. Of course she knew. She'd had 8 months to prepare her defenses, 8 months to convert my inheritance into assets that might be harder to claw back, 8 months to build a life with Jeremy while pretending to build one with me. In my hotel room, I spread the evidence across the desk like battle plans. Financial records, surveillance photos, legal documents. The paper trail was damning and complete. Every phone call, every transfer, every forged signature was documented. Sarah and Jeremy had been careful, but they'd underestimated the resources available to the grandson of William Morrison III. Grandfather's money hadn't just been about wealth. It had been about power, connections, the ability to marshal resources when necessary. They'd stolen from the wrong family. I called Sarah at exactly 11 p.m. She answered on the third ring, her voice cautious. "David, you're back." In the background, I could hear Jeremy say something, then footsteps moving away from the phone. "I'm at the Copley," I said. "Just got in. Flight was delayed." She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you come home? I would have picked you up." "Because it's not my home anymore," I thought. "Because I didn't want to risk losing control when I saw you and Jeremy together." "I thought we should talk tomorrow," I said instead. "Take some time to adjust. Both of us." "Of course," she said too quickly. "That's probably smart. This deployment was longer than the others. Tomorrow's good." I could hear the relief in her voice. One more night to prepare. One more night to move assets or coordinate stories with Jeremy. "I've missed you," she added, the lies smooth as silk. "The apartments missed you too. No doubt. It was probably unrecognizable, redecorated with my stolen money, furnished for a life I'd never agreed to share with Jeremy Fletcher." After hanging up, I stood at the window looking out at Boston Common. Couples walked hand in hand along the paths where Sarah and I had walked countless times. In my grandfather's day, men fought duels over lesser betrayals. Now we fought with lawyers and accountants and federal prosecutors. But the principle was the same. Honor demanded a response. Justice required action. Grandfather would have expected nothing less. Richard called at 6 a.m. "Everything's ready. Chen's team is in position. The FBI is standing by. How do you want to handle the initial contact?" We discussed several approaches. The surprise confrontation, the formal legal notice, the diplomatic meeting that would slowly reveal our knowledge. I chose directness. "I'll go to the apartment. You'll be in the car. When I give the signal, you come up with the paperwork." It felt appropriate that this should begin in the space I called home, in front of the woman I'd called wife. The walk to Joy Street took 12 minutes. I knew because I'd walked it hundreds of times, coming home from work, from PT, from late nights with military friends. The apartment building looked exactly the same. Mrs. Kowalski still had her plants on the fire escape. Mr. Chin still had his newspapers piled by his door. Nothing had changed except everything. At the entrance, I used my key. It still worked. Sarah hadn't bothered changing the locks. That felt like an insult worse than the theft. I climbed the stairs slowly, gathering myself. In Afghanistan, before difficult operations, I developed a routine: breathe deeply, check equipment, review objectives, accept what might go wrong. Now, standing outside the apartment I'd shared with Sarah for 4 years, I ran through the same checklist. My objective was simple: recover what was stolen. My equipment was legal documents and irrefutable evidence. What might go wrong was that I'd lose control, say something I'd regret, act in a way that would compromise the legal strategy Richard had so carefully constructed. I knocked instead of using my key. That felt important somehow. I was no longer a resident. I was a visitor in what used to be my own home. Sarah answered after a long moment, wearing a robe I didn't recognize. She was showing slightly, the pregnancy visible now that I knew to look for it. "David," she said, attempting surprise. "You're early." Jeremy appeared behind her, also in a robe. My robe, I realized, the one Sarah had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. He looked uncomfortable, but tried to project confidence. "You must be David," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Jeremy Fletcher." I ignored his hand and walked into my apartment. The changes were extensive. Our furniture was gone, replaced with sleek modern pieces. The walls were a different color. Even the hardwood floors looked different, refinished and gleaming. Photographs of Sarah and me had been replaced with abstract art. The kitchen had been remodeled. New appliances, new cabinets, a new island where our breakfast table used to be. They'd used my inheritance money to erase every trace of my presence from our shared space. "Coffee," Sarah offered, moving toward the kitchen. Her movements were nervous, jerky. She knew. Jeremy sat on a sofa I'd never seen before, in the spot where my reading chair used to be. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 30, with the soft look of someone who'd never worked physically demanding jobs or spent months in the field. "This is a bit awkward," he said with a nervous smile. "Sarah's told me so much about you." I remained standing, creating a physical advantage that felt important. "I'm sure she has." Then, to Sarah, "We need to talk about the money." The words hung in the air like artillery rounds waiting to explode. Sarah froze halfway to the coffee maker. Jeremy's attempt at casual confidence evaporated. They exchanged a look that confirmed everything I suspected. They'd been planning for this moment. "The money?" Sarah repeated, attempting confusion. "David, you're scaring me. What money?" I pulled out my phone and showed them a bank statement Richard had printed. Our joint account nearly empty. The trust accounts systematically drained. 8 months of transactions, each one a nail in the coffin of our marriage. "This money," I said, "the money my grandfather left us. The money you've been transferring to accounts I never authorized." Jeremy stood up, and I noticed he was taller than me but softer. No military bearing, no calluses on his hands. The kind of man who stole from warriors while they fought wars. "Look, David," he said, "there's been a misunderstanding." I cut him off. "A misunderstanding? Is that what we're calling forged signatures now? Fraudulent power of attorney documents? Theft of $2.5 million? Sarah started crying. The tears looked real enough. But then again, she'd been acting for months. "I can explain everything," she said. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. The gallery was cutting hours. I didn't know when you were coming back. Jeremy was helping me manage the finances. Each lie was perfectly crafted, designed to shift blame and create doubt. But I'd spent months reviewing every transaction. There was no confusion about what had happened here." I walked to the window and pulled out my phone. Richard answered on the first ring. "Now," I said, then hung up. Sarah and Jeremy looked confused. "What was that?" Jeremy asked. I turned to face them both. That was my signal for the attorneys to come up. "We need to discuss restitution, criminal charges, and asset recovery. You might want to call Martin Goldberg. I believe he's already representing you, Sarah." The look of shock on Sarah's face was worth every moment of the past 8 months of pain. They thought they were dealing with a simple soldier husband, someone who'd be too heartbroken or too overwhelmed to fight back effectively. They hadn't prepared for methodical investigation, professional legal representation, or the resources that came with old Boston family money. Jeremy seemed to grasp the implications faster than Sarah. "We can work this out," he said quickly. "There's no need for lawyers. We can come to an arrangement." Richard's knock came exactly 2 minutes later. Sarah opened the door to find not just my attorney, but David Chun and 2 federal investigators. Sarah Morrison, Richard said formally, you're being served with papers alleging fraud, conspiracy, and theft. Jeremy Fletcher, you're being served with similar papers, plus charges of forgery and wire fraud. The investigators had badges that they displayed briefly. FBI Financial Crimes Division. This wasn't just a civil matter anymore. The next hour was surreal. Sarah collapsed into sobs. Jeremy tried to argue with the investigators. Richard calmly explained that all joint assets were frozen immediately, that the apartment would be sealed pending investigation, and that both of them needed to retain legal representation. Chin documented everything with photos and video. The federal agents asked preliminary questions, established timelines, identified the scope of the conspiracy. Through it all, I stood quietly by the window, watching my former life be systematically dismantled. Sarah kept looking at me, trying to catch my eye, perhaps hoping for some sign of the man who'd loved her for 5 years. But that man had died somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan when he learned what love meant to the woman he'd married. This man was a stranger, someone forged in 8 months of betrayal, and now tempered by the requirements of justice. Jeremy finally showed his true nature when the investigators mentioned potential prison time. This is her idea, he shouted, pointing at Sarah. She came to me. She forged your signature. I just provided financial advice. Sarah's sobs turned to shrieks of denial. The facade cracked completely as they turned on each other like animals in a corner. 8 months of shared guilt dissolved in moments when they realized the consequences were real. The investigators separated them for initial interviews. I remained with Richard as he explained what came next. Criminal charges would be filed within days. All stolen funds would be recovered, plus penalties. The apartment would be sold to cover restitution. Both Sarah and Jeremy faced significant prison time if convicted. The justice system doesn't move as fast as we'd like, Richard warned me, but it moves. This case is solid. They have no viable defense. When the agents finished their preliminary work, the apartment was effectively a crime scene. Sarah and Jeremy were allowed to pack essential items under supervision. Sarah tried one last appeal. David, please. The baby, she said, one hand on her stomach. I looked at her for a long moment. The baby that is mine? I asked, the baby you made with the man who helped you steal my inheritance? She had no answer for that. Jeremy was let out first, muttering about lawyers and lawsuits. Sarah lingered, looking around the apartment that had been our home. I loved you, she said quietly. I considered various responses, accusations, questions about when the love had died, demands to know how she could betray someone who trusted her completely. Instead, I said, you love my grandfather's money. You love the security it provided. You never loved me enough to wait 8 months without stealing from me. The apartment felt enormous after they left. I walked through rooms I'd shared with Sarah, now seeing them as crime scenes where trust had been murdered. In the bedroom, I found a picture hidden behind their new dresser. Sarah and me on our wedding day, both of us young and hopefully naive. I'd believed in forever then. She'd probably been calculating how long she could maintain the facade. Richard found me there an hour later. They're both in custody for questioning, he said. Initial charges will be filed tonight. The DA wants to move fast before they can hide more assets or flee. Chun found evidence that they had plane tickets to the Cayman Islands purchased for next week. They'd been preparing to run. If I hadn't come home when I did, they'd have disappeared with everything, leaving me with nothing but debt and questions. That night, back at the hotel, I called my parents. They'd known about the divorce filing, but not the scope of the theft. My father, himself a veteran, listened quietly as I explained everything. Your grandfather would be proud, he said finally. You didn't let anger control your response. You used the system, built a case, and got justice. That's what he would have done. My mother offered to fly up from Florida. I declined. This was something I needed to handle alone. The next morning brought a call from Sarah's lawyer, Martin Goldberg. He wanted to discuss plea arrangements, reduction of charges, possible settlement agreements. My client made some mistakes, he said, but she's pregnant and scared. Surely we can reach an understanding that doesn't require federal prison time. I listened politely, then referred him to Richard. There would be no mercy for people who'd stolen from a deployed soldier. They'd made their choices while I was serving my country. Now they'd live with the consequences. The investigation moved quickly. Chen's evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed patterns of theft. Video surveillance captured forged signatures being created. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls between Sarah and Jeremy while I was deployed. Most damning were email exchanges discussing how to manage David's military pension and prepare for the transition after the war. They'd been planning this since before my deployment began. 3 days after my confrontation, federal agents raided Jeremy's apartment and found evidence linking him to similar schemes targeting other military spouses. The investigation expanded. Patricia Wells, the researcher who'd helped them identify targets, was arrested at her Arlington apartment. Marcus Stone, the lawyer who created fake legal documents, was already in federal custody. Sarah and Jeremy weren't just thieves. They were part of an organized ring that specialized in victimizing military families during deployments. The media caught the story a week later. Local woman charged with stealing military husband's inheritance. Deployed soldier discovers wife's elaborate theft scheme. Federal investigation uncovers network targeting military families. Sarah's photo appeared in every Boston news outlet. The woman who'd once worried about her privacy now found herself infamous for all the wrong reasons. I testified before a federal grand jury, presenting the evidence methodically, answering questions with military precision. The jurors, several of them veterans themselves, looked increasingly angry as the scope of conspiracy became clear. When the prosecutor showed photos of our apartment, remodeled with stolen money, while I served overseas, one juror shook her head in disgust. The indictments were inevitable. Richard negotiated the civil settlement, while federal prosecutors prepared the criminal case. Full restitution plus penalties. The Martha's Vineyard property returned to the trust. The Boston apartment sold to cover damages. Both Sarah and Jeremy's personal assets seized. By conservative estimates, they have to pay back over $5 million combined. Even if they spend the next 20 years paying, they'd never cover full amount. Jeremy broke first. Faced with 15 years in federal prison, he agreed to testify against Sarah and the rest of the ring. His confession filled in details I'd never known. Sarah had researched my grandfather's estate before we married. She'd specifically targeted me for my inheritance potential. Our entire relationship had been a long con, designed to gain access to old Boston money. She'd seen my military service as an opportunity, not as something to respect. Sarah's plea negotiations were more complex. Goldberg argued for reduced charges based on her pregnancy, claimed she was a victim of Jeremy's manipulation. The prosecutor wasn't interested. Your client forged federal documents, she said. She stole from a deployed soldier. She participated in a conspiracy that targeted military families across 3 states. Pregnancy doesn't excuse treason to the military community. The final resolution came 8 months after my return. Sarah pleaded guilty to fraud, theft, and conspiracy charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. 7 years in federal prison, though she'd be eligible for parole in 4. The baby would be born while she was in custody. Jeremy received 12 years with no parole possibility for organizing conspiracy. The other ring members received various sentences, all significant enough to deter future similar crimes. I attended the sentencing hearing, wearing my dress uniform. It seemed appropriate to remind the court why these crimes deserved serious consequences. Sarah looked different in her orange jumpsuit, swollen with pregnancy, her hair beginning to show gray. When the judge asked if I wanted to provide a victim impact statement, I stood and spoke briefly. Your Honor, these defendants didn't just steal money. They stole my faith in marriage, my trust and love, my ability to serve my country without worrying about betrayal at home. They targeted military families precisely because we were vulnerable, because we couldn't monitor our homes while serving overseas. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was calculated exploitation of military sacrifice. I asked the court to consider not just what they took from me, but what they took from every military family they victimized. After the hearing, Martin Goldberg approached me outside the courthouse. "She wanted me to tell you she's sorry," he said. I looked back at the building where my former wife was being processed into federal custody. She had 8 months to tell me herself. I replied, she chose to steal instead. We left it at that. The financial recovery took longer than the criminal case. The Martha's Vineyard property was cleaned of the renovations Jeremy and Sarah had made, restored to its original state. The Boston apartment sold for enough to cover most of their debt, though the full restitution would take years to collect. Richard established new protections for the trust, ensuring that future generations would never face similar vulnerability. I used my terminal leave to stay in Boston through the trials and appeals. The city felt different now, charged with bad memories and painful associations. Every restaurant, every street corner, every shared space carried echoes of my marriage to Sarah. But it also carried echoes of my grandfather, his lessons about preparation and persistence and the value of delayed gratification. His trust provisions had saved me. His resources had brought justice. His memory had given me strength when grief threatened to overwhelm duty. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a letter from Sarah's prison. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. The letter was brief. She'd had the baby, a girl she named David. After me, she claimed. She was writing to apologize, to explain that she'd never meant for things to go so far, to ask if I could forgive her someday. The letter ended with a request that I visit her daughter occasionally, to provide some connection to the military service that had supposedly made Sarah proud. I read the letter twice, then burned it in my hotel room wastebasket. Some betrayals are too complete for forgiveness. Some wounds don't heal even with justice. The baby wasn't my responsibility, no matter what name Sarah had given her. My responsibility was to rebuild a life that Sarah and Jeremy had tried to destroy, to find some way to trust again, to serve my country without the constant fear that someone was destroying my home while I protected theirs. A year later, I took a new assignment with the 75th Ranger Regiment at Fort Benning, a fresh start in a place with no memories of Sarah. The transfer felt like a tactical withdrawal, a strategic repositioning rather than a retreat. Georgia was different enough from Massachusetts that I could begin again without constant reminders of what I'd lost. The Rangers were a brotherhood that understood sacrifice and betrayal, honor and consequences. The inheritance saga officially closed 2 years after my return from Afghanistan. All funds were recovered, all sentences served, all appeals exhausted. Richard retired, satisfied that justice had prevailed. Chin moved to other cases, other betrayals, other families learning that trust was a luxury soldiers couldn't always afford. I kept the Martha's Vineyard property but rarely visited. It reminded me too much of grandfather's lessons about character and consequences, lessons that still felt too raw to appreciate. On the 3rd anniversary of my discovery, I was promoted to major. The promotion ceremony was simple, attended by military friends who understood that accomplishment meant moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. Afterward, I called Richard to thank him one final time. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. "You took his lessons about patience and preparation and used them to protect his legacy. That's what he would have wanted. Maybe. All I knew was that I'd learned something essential about the difference between love and security, between marriage and contract, between trust and legal protection." The war in Afghanistan ended gradually, as wars do, with withdrawals and negotiations and questions about what had been accomplished. My war with Sarah ended more definitively, with convictions and restitution, and the clean finality of legal victory. Both wars taught me things I had wanted to learn about human nature, about the distance between rhetoric and reality, about the price of trusting the wrong people with the right intentions. I never remarried, though not for lack of opportunity. The uniform attracted its share of attention, and military life created natural opportunities for connection. But I'd learned to watch for signs I'd missed with Sarah. Questions about money that came too early. Interest in inheritance that seemed too keen. Women who knew more about my background than I'd shared. Trust, I discovered, was like military equipment. It had to be inspected regularly, maintained constantly, and replaced when it showed signs of wear. Years passed. I made colonel, I deployed again, this time to different deserts, different wars, different complications. But I never again left for war without ensuring that everything important was protected, that every asset was monitored, that every document was secure. Sarah had taught me something valuable in the worst possible way. She taught me that vigilance wasn't paranoia when the threats were real, that preparation wasn't cowardice when trust could be so easily violated. The inheritance that had cost me a marriage had given me something else: independence, the knowledge that I could survive betrayal, the resources to find justice when justice was needed, and perhaps most importantly, the understanding that some lessons cost everything but teach you what nothing else could. My grandfather's money had been stolen and recovered. My grandfather's lessons had been tested and proven true. His legacy wasn't just wealth. It was a wisdom to protect what mattered, the patience to wait for justice, and the strength to rebuild when everything fell apart. Today, I carry photos in my wallet, not of Sarah, but my grandfather, of my rangers who served with honor, of my parents who taught me that character mattered more than comfort, of the men and women who proved that loyalty wasn't just a word. The space where Sarah's picture once lived remains empty. Some spaces were meant to stay that way, reminders of what happened when trust was given too freely to people who didn't deserve it. The inheritance story ended with recovered money and prison sentences. The real story ended with the understanding that some victories cost more than defeats, that some justice came too late to prevent heartbreak, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in distant mountains, but in the familiar spaces we call home. Sarah had asked for forgiveness in her letter from prison. I'd given her something better. I'd given her consequences. In the end, that was all the mercy that people like her deserved.